He rangi tā mata whaiti, he rangi tā mata whānui. Nau mai ki te mata e whera nei i te whānuitanga o kōrero o te wā e pā oro ana i te motu. Welcome to Mata with me, Mihingarangi Forbes, brought to you by Te Māngai Pāho and the Public Interest Journalism Fund. Lots to discuss with our panellists, Dr. Lara Greaves and Dr. Flavell this episode. National's bilingual backflip, Labour's super showdown, and what was in the budget for Māori. Hei huataki i te wānanga nei, ka hurihia te aroaro ki te tai Rāwhiti. Papatūānuku is battered and bleeding, Ranginui fury, and Tāne Mahuta bent and breaking. That's the finding of a Ministerial Inquiry into forestry / woody debris and sedimentation in Te Tai Rāwhiti and Wairoa following Cyclone Gabrielle. The 44-page report, led by Hekia Parata, is a damning review of the forestry industry and describes a failure of leadership and governance at a local level, saying people reported increased anxiety and depression, fear and paranoia, and feeling overwhelmed, stressed and abandoned. It calls for urgent action and warns tangata whenua could be left landless if the status quo remains. Hei whakamahuki i te whānuitanga o tēnei ripoata. Ko hono mai Hekia Parata. Ms. Parata joins us now via Zoom. Tēnā koe te marae kura.
Kia ora, tēnā koe.
This report, it's entitled Outrage to Optimism. How te tikanga o tērā?
Ko te pāpauri, te pā mamai ki ngā tāngata o te Tai Rāwhiti, o tira o Tūranganui Ākiwa, me te Wairoa. In every engagement we had from Te Araroa in the north to Ngātapa in the south of Gisborne, out to Te Wairoa, we met with, heard from, saw and felt the mamai and alienation, sense of abandonment and anger and frustration at feeling invisible to the government, to the local authority. And so we recorded all of those feelings, and they were across the 8 sections of our report that dealt with the woody debris, that dealt with infrastructure failure, use and abuse of the whenua by forestry, but also by other land uses, broken bridges and roads, the lack of availability of economic levers to help with sustainable employment and quality life experiences. And we heard it all in our direct engagements, but we also received over 300 very high quality written submissions that amplified what people told us directly. So the report is characterised in terms of outrage at long-term deprivation of ad hoc interventions by successive governments, of not being seen and not being counted. And for instance, we had that feedback about why State Highway 35 is constantly breaking and cutting off communities. And it's because our community only rates on poverty and isolation. So that was the outrage, the loss of power, the loss of telecommunications, the loss of water infrastructure. I mean, these are the sorts of things we see on CNN and BBC when we're talking about communities that need intervention. And here in Tai Rāwhiti, we need that as well. However, our report also arrived at optimism because it captured the elements of not just hope, but powerful forward-looking adaptation to climate, energy, concern for the environment and how we live with it, how we marry productivity with biodiversity. So the report has an arc that goes through all of those senses of outrage and arrives at a place of urgent demand, if you like, for transformation.
You say that we've literally got 10 years to turn it around, and the report has a whole list of strong recommendations. Where would you start?
Well, first of all, our panel would recommend that it's an integrated package. The 10 years arose from a really cut-through, really frightening fact that we learnt from a land care scientist who spent 40 years studying gullies. And what we know from that meeting and the research that we were able to look at is that just over half of the sedimentation that ends up in the waterways come from untreated gullies. And if you think of the coast as a body and State Highway 35 as the main artery, it is broken so many times that stents are not going to do it anymore. We need a full transplant. Our gullies, before Cyclone Gabrielle, there were 1,864 recorded gullies. Now there will be many more. And if you think of those as haki in the body, or in the metaphor of the body, they have to be treated, they have to be ground covered, they have to stop supporting exotic pines that are too heavy for the rims of those gullies. I didn't know before this inquiry that there are different types of gully, and we have far too many amphitheatre gullies that in the report you will see above one stretch of the Waiapu that it's hemorrhaging soil into the river, which then goes down to the sea. You'll see inside the front cover of the report the erodibility map for Te Rāwhiti and Turanganuiākua and Te Wairoa. And you will see the red, which is the erodibility, and that shows that that soil is literally hemorrhaging. Now, what those scientists say is that we can retrieve the situation. We have to start dressing with healing cover those gullies, planting appropriate plants to give them canopy cover, making purple zones where you cannot now do any production type forestry or farming, and restoring the catchments. So we have to start with being committed to not just the recovery post-Cyclone Gabrielle, but to a reset and a strong movement forward towards a climate-adapted living with a biodiverse environment, as well as productivity for jobs and income.
Tell us a little bit more about the purple zone. I think the idea is that they are not going to be touched. You're going to identify which is the purple zone, and how are you going to work with the landowners and the government and the local government to make that work?
Well, at the moment, there are several grades of land, and they are colour-coded. Orange and red are the most erodible. That's mainly where the remaining whenua Māori is also located in the red and orange zones. And currently, exotic pine plantations are being planted on those most erodible soils on very steep slopes. So gravity and common sense will tell you that they're going to come down, and they have been. And what we're recommending is that within those red zones, we now go to a greater level of granularity and make that a purple zone, which means that you can no longer do any activity on those particular zones except to heal them and retire those mawiri rawatu ngā pokohiwi o era puke, and let them retire gracefully and start restoring the biodiversity that will start regenerating if we do that. But we also have to have restore catchment management. We've recommended that both the Waipu River and the Waipawa River be given legal status, and that would mean then active governance over the headwaters, but also down through their tributaries. The Waipu is, I think, second in the world for the amount of sedimentation that it carries out to sea. And of course, that means land, that means farms being carried out to sea. And as one of the people said at our hui, you can't farm soil in the sea. And so we have to keep it on the whenua, and we have to find ways of doing both biodiverse activity that restores the mana of the taiao and commercial productive activities that provide employment in ways that still respect the particular landform and the land type. So we're recommending moving to a mosaic approach, and so for particular ecosystems with particular characteristics, allow only land uses that will work well with that. And that means the local authority, the Gisborne District Council, updating their plans and providing for those prescriptions of what is allowed and what is not allowed.
How did we get to this point where Te Tai Rāwhiti, as you say, is, her tinana is breaking?
Long-term isolation. Te Rāwhiti, you have to be going there to get there, right? And it's not on the way to anywhere except our heartland and Mihingarangi, and the welcoming of each new day. And so, we are not visible. Our soils, our terrain, our topography, the underlying geomorphology, they are all very complex systems that operate there. And, many years ago, when I was a young advisor in Prime Minister David Lange's advisory group, I was one of the officials working on the post-cyclone bowler options, and that's where afforestation with pines came in. And the understanding at the time was that that was what was going to be the key solution for saving that whenua. Of course, the planting approach and the harvesting approach at that time was under the Forest Service. So they got planted in the appropriate place. They got harvested in the appropriate way. That has not happened now for a couple of decades. And while the Gisborne District Council certainly did make submissions against the plantation framework that was announced by the government, that we found that they did not exercise the discretions that they should have, because they know the complexity of those landforms. So that's why we recommended technical support for the GDC, because it's small with a slim rating base, and it has not been able to get across some of these core requirements of local authorities.
Yeah, some local authorities have not been happy with the findings of the report. What's your response to those local authorities?
Our criticisms are extremely well referenced and evidenced. And so what we were saying was this lack of keeping up to date the plans that relate to how the waterways and the lands are used have directly contributed to the emergency that is now occurring in Te Rāwhiti. And we went on to say, but help is on the way. We recommend that technical support in carrying out the resource management functions be made available to the Gisborne District Council. We recommended that there be additional support in operational delivery in the recovery period, and we strongly recommended shared regional leadership with the mana whenua as well as the Gisborne District Council. And we are hoping that the Mayor and the Council take on board that the criticisms were valid, and now it's time to get on and deal with them, because it's about the health and safety of the people, of the communities, and of the whenua.
You've made it very clear in this report that these recommendations are specifically for Te Rāwhiti, not Wairoa Aotearoa. And just before we go, one of the last recommendations I wanted to talk about is, because it's a growing industry, is the carbon farming, the ETS. What is your warning there for Te Rāwhiti?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that in the district plans, it's made clear what land is not available for that use, because we have two beautiful stations, Wairoa and Matanui, that are idyllic pastoral lands. They met the criteria for the Overseas Investment Office and therefore have been sold into carbon farming. So those plans, unsexy as they might be, are what says what's allowed to be planted, where and when and by who. And so those need to be updated. But it's not just about the ETS. One of the particular parts of our report that I'm really excited about is solving three wicked problems with one solution. So if I could quickly run through that. Whenua Māori, of which Ngāti Porou has the most across Aotearoa, but also a lot of it is inaccessible, it's landlocked, it's coded red or orange, it's got hundreds if not thousands of shareholders, some have governance entities, others do not. It's really difficult to get capital to develop that whenua, yet, as our report says, it's often predated upon for public goods, for the roads, for the corridors, for power poles, etc. and so forth. But here's the thing. There is an opportunity that our report showcases to have the government, which has been the sole investor to date, but generally for feasibility studies that then don't run into actual development and production, to co-invest by creating the first biodiversity market in our country and potentially the world. And there are government statements, both internationally at COP last year and domestically about our commitment to climate mitigation, to adaptation, and so on and so forth, and how critical it is to begin to have biodiversity credits and a biodiversity market. Because otherwise, what we are all focusing on is how do we make the ETS have less perverse incentives. But the fact of the matter is that ETS focuses purely on carbon tonnage, and native trees take much longer to sequester carbon. So instead of trying to change that to be something that it isn't, we're recommending that absolutely there should be a biodiversity market that has a price for biodiversity credits, that then has a symbiotic relationship with the ETS. And right in Tai Rāwhiti and on whenua Māori across Aotearoa New Zealand, it would be possible, we think, for the government to invest in whenua Māori and put investment-ready projects onto a biodiversity market. And we've named the East Coast Exchange, which has been developed by some local innovators, as one of the possibilities. There are others. And then profile that for co-investment. Okay. There'd be a lot of interest in both biodiversity in the complex landscape that I've just described for Tai Rāwhiti, for Te Wairoa, for Northland, for the West Coast. But at the moment, my kaupapa is Tai Rāwhiti.
Ka pai.
And that would then create the first biodiversity market, and we can move past te kōrero a ngutu noiho and ka tukuna ki te ao, ka tono atu ki te ao, ho mai tō herengi, engari he miriona tāra, hei āwhina tēnei kaupapa, te aki te whakapakari ngā whenua Māori. So the report is a prescription for transformation. Thank you.
Kia ora, tēnā koe e te rangatira. Look forward to hearing from the government's response to those ideas. Ko Hekia Parata tira. Inai nei, ko te reo rāhiri tēnei ki ngā kanohi kai mātārai I hono mai nei. I'm joined now by two doctors. They can't get $5 off your prescription, but they can make you way smarter. Political scientist at Victoria University, Dr. Lara Greaves, and Fulbright scholar with the University of Massachusetts, Dr. Flavell. Tēnā kōrua.
Kia ora, mōrena.
Mōrena. Hey, so Lara, thoughts on that report and Hekia's interview?
Yeah, so I opened up the report and it's just, something wasn't clicking. But Hekia Parata, she just explains it really well. She's animated, she's got the love for it, you can see it. And I think that the communication on the report, it comes through really clearly, and it's actually really quite upsetting because for years we've heard from mainly our Pacific cousins that, hey, climate change is going to be causing people to be dislocated from their whenua. But this is a clear example of it happening in Aotearoa, and we know it's happening around the place. We hear that from the regions, we hear that from people all the time. And so I think this is really upsetting. And yeah, it made me feel a bit nauseous. I'm like, damn. But it's that thing of what's the next step? Are they going to actually do something? There's 10 million in the budget for slash cleanup, but what are the next steps? Is it this just going to be the warming of the climate where we just kind of sit, twiddle our thumbs and, oh no.
West is best, that's where you're from. You've had your fair share of flooding and climate change related weather events. Did you think there's a good plan in there?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I acknowledge, Hekia Parata. It's great to see her well. And just with that report, she completed that report within 8 to 9 weeks. Yep. And what I really liked about it is some very strong emotive language used in there. In the first half of the 4 weeks, she actually went out to the community, interviewed over 500 people. I think that was really important to do so, because out west, you know what, we've had so many people are massively affected by the floods and climate change. A lot of people can't return back to their homes as well, so that's problematic. And I think also the report also acknowledges that the local council in the particular area needs a lot of work to do. Yeah. And obviously Auckland Council.
And she's suggesting that they need some support so they don't have to do it by themselves.
Absolutely.
Let's talk politics. The polls are mixed and there's two clear things. It's close.
Yeah.
And while the party is still in the running, its leader Christopher Luxon is not impressing voters. What do you think they're going to do? What do they need?
Yeah, key weakness for National is the fact that he's just not connecting. He's just not building that kind of trusting relationship, or to me, I always put it down to his seeming inability to take the piss out of himself in the way that Chippy is. Chippy's all sausage rolls, and that dumb joke we've heard a million times about his dress sense that almost kind of lands a bit daggy at this point, but it's dad. It's dad.
Helps to be from Upper Hutt.
Yeah, the Hutt jokes, all of those, but Luxon, something about him that's not quite landing. I saw on his Instagram, him and his wife cooking fish the other day, cool, but it's just something needs to connect a bit more. And I hate that kind of politics, that presidentialisation, but it's the reality of our modern politics.
Yeah, the left also has a bit of a problem. It's a bit busy in there with 3 parties at the moment that still aren't making it across the line. What needs to happen there?
Well, you know, we've got 19 weeks until the general election, and we've got basically neck and neck with, you know, National and ACT Party, and also, you know, Māori, the Te Pāti Māori Labour and the Greens. And so I think Chris Hipkins, you know, did a really good job in explaining key areas of policy in the Congress conference last weekend in Wellington. I think he needs to continue to do that. I think Luxon's problem is that, you know, he's not connecting well with his target audience, and perhaps he needs to ask you know, Bishop and Willis to actually step up more, to take the range in terms of being more actively involved in the public for the National Party.
They introduced super this week. You know, they're going to keep it at 65. Is that a win for Māori?
Well, it's a tough one because, you know, in terms of life expectancy for Māori, a lot of Māori don't perhaps reach 65. I'd like to see perhaps Māori be able to access some of that funding earlier on, but I guess that perhaps would be a win for Aotearoa. I'd actually like to see means testing for that particular kaupapa, because we've got those who are earning so much money and still able to you know, benefit from that particular benefit. So yeah, I think more work needs to be looked at with that particular kaupapa.
Do you think a more targeted scheme for super?
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about our kids who are 20 and they're going to be paying tax till, you know, forever, and then who knows if there's going to be anything left.
Yeah, that huge inequity where there are people that because they've been in manual labour, they do have to retire. 65 is like stretching it for them. And then there are people like some of our professor colleagues, they're like in their 70s, they're drawing a great salary, and like they love working and they can keep doing that. But that inequity is huge between those two groups of people. And it's just comes back to that little bit of that moral issue. Well, like, what's that extra money for those people on those 100k plus salaries versus those who really, really need it and really do need to retire through those manual labour jobs?
Simeon Brown might be having a bit of real trauma this week. He started off saying that bilingual signs should not be a thing, and then the parties come in over the top and said actually they support it. What do you think about, I mean, the mixed messages?
Yeah, you know, it is quite sad to see that, but that's not unexpected from Simeon Brown. You know, Aotearoa New Zealand is maturing as a country, and it's in terms of naturalising Aotearoa Māori in all our public spaces. You know, a language that is seen, that is heard, that is felt, and that is read. That's important for the ongoing revitalisation of Te Reo Māori. So it's a shame that we've got these mixed messages from the National Party. But that's not unexpected from Simeon Brown at all.
Will says that we're growing as a nation, but then you look at Christopher Luxon's getting back on track, hui, and you know, everyone wants to talk about too much the old co-governance and all those kaupapas. Are they, you know, is that an old playbook they're going into?
Yeah, it's a weird one because, like, realistically, they've got to win over middle voters, and all of the evidence shows there is a pocket of people that are anti-Māori. They exist. But like there may be 20% of the population, depending on how you're measuring it. Like it's a sentiment, it's there. But give it to David Seymour, give it to ACT. They're representing that group of the population a lot better than National is. Like I don't know why I'm focusing on their interests.
Are they losing sight of the middle ground?
Yeah, the middle ground. Like this is not something that, you know, and then it becomes that back and forth, like that mixed messaging, that getting dragged into it, and the media's like, oh, there's a scrap. And so then the focus and the conversation has been around the signs, but it's like they could be talking about something else, and it just ends up very negative and putting off the middle.
Well, they said the National Party said they were going to stand Māori candidates, and they've announced their first candidate for Tamaki Makato, Hinurewa Te Hau. Do you know much about Hinurewa?
You know, first of all, you know, well done for National for actually putting up candidates in their Māori seats.
First time in 20 years, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. I haven't heard of the Tamaki Makato candidate for National, but I guess it's really important to have a different view when it comes to the election this year, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say.
In the past, sometimes the National Party might get about 10% of the party vote in those seats for people who are registered in the Māori role. Will it change now that you can jump across?
Yeah, well, we've got till 13th of July to kind of figure out where we're going to be for the election, and that's just like a reminder for everyone to tell their whānau that date, that's the new law, that they need to do that, because that's admin. I still haven't posted mine off. It's sitting on my counter. But like, we've got to do it. But what we see for our research, like I ran a survey on this last year, that actually most Māori on the Māori roll are not really that kind of classic national voter, and that pocket of people who are more national voting might just switch to the general role. So really we're operating in the dark here. We don't know where people are going to go and for what reason to what role, but I suspect that, the position of any national candidate on the Māori role is going to be to just be like, here's national, here's our policy, this is who we are, and just kind of contest Labour. I think that's their job rather than to win as such.
Come election season, what will the Māori ministers be able to skate about in the last budget?
Well, obviously the prescriptions, that's really important as well. The early childhood fees, so for those between 2 to 3, I think that's really important for our whānau Māori. I think the big boost for Matariki was really important, and also the after effects of COVID-19 and how that's affected our communities. I think the whānau order funding would also really support that in our whānau.
How important is the Matatini boost? Because is that going to win some Māori Party voters, you reckon?
I don't know if it will necessarily win them over from Te Pāti Māori, because they are so kapahaka, so matatini, like that, there's so much on that. So I don't necessarily know how much it will win people over, but I think it's a good policy. It's a good policy based on all the evidence. Various Māori academics have done a lot of work on it, showing the well-being that comes from te matatini, and it's a good investment on that holistic, that broader long-term investment. But I think it's that good thing where, again, the left bloc is probably going to maybe include Te Pāti Māori, so it's kind of almost like something for them. And I think someone like Willow Jean Prime, I was thinking the other day, when you're 80 years old, you're reflecting back on your political career, I imagine that will be one of those things where you're that's a win for them.
Tau Hinari says that about Mā Te Reo funding, which created all of these punareo, so I think you're right there. Where do you think this big boost of money should be spent in terms of Te Matatini on the infrastructure, because it sounds like that's where it's going rather than the people?
So if you look at our secondary schools, we've just recently introduced te ao haka as a subject that sits alongside any other subject. So it's not a unit standard subject anymore, Māori Performing Arts. I like to see more funding directed towards our secondary schools and how we connect te ao haka, so those students learn te ao haka, and the matatini focus as well. I think we need to really get it out there in terms of, I guess, the whakangaho of kapahaka as well. I like to see more of that come to light, because I'm never going to be on a matatini stage. You guys
really
are,
not.
but I like to do a bit of, I like to participate in other ways.
Yes, I will never be on a matatini stage, but I will look forward to the day that my daughters represent us. Tēnā kōrua, thank you for coming in today. He toka tū moana he ākinga nā ngā tai, aha ko ngā ākinga o te wā, he oranga kei roto i ngā kupu tuku iho e aki ana i a tātou, kia toka, kia te tikaha. Ka nui te mihi ki te puna whakatonga rewa me te Māngai Pāho. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back in a fortnight. Nō horo mai.